Good afternoon and welcome back to the breakout session for exceptions in contract negotiations. Julie Mileham and Lee Taylor will be presenting and be here to answer your questions. Please be sure to type your questions in the chat box throughout the presentation and we'll read them at the end or as instructed by your presenters. I want to give a couple of backgrounds into our presenters today. Julie Mileham is the director of the State Office of Risk Management. She's worked for the state for almost 6 years. Prior to working at the State Office of Risk Management, she was at CDOT for 4 years and a metro area school district for 18. Julie has worked in risk management and insurance for close to 20 years. Lee Taylor has been with the state of Colorado for just under 6 years, but has been in the insurance and claim industry since 1987. Her claims experience runs from claims involving small auto property losses to complex commercial claims involving serious injury or death and property losses involving millions of dollars. She's also been a broker advising individuals and commercial clients of their insurance needs to protect their assets. Her current position with the state is managing the liability claims process and adjusters and providing review of changes to insurance, indemnification, and limitations of liability in our vendor contracts when needed. Lee and Julie, I'll turn it over to you guys.
All right, thanks. I don't know if Julie's on right now. I think she has a conflicting thing, but she'll probably try to join us later if she's not on right now. So I'll go ahead and get started on the presentation. I'm Lee Taylor, and again, appreciate all of you signing in and joining us this afternoon, giving us your time. I know that insurance can be frustrating. There's no black and white, it's always a gray issue, and we're here to try and help you with that as much as possible. And please let us know at any time if you have any questions. So let's go ahead and just kind of dive in here. Next slide. And so SORM has to review contracts statutorily because of the fact that the State Office of Risk Management handles all claims of liability against the state. And if we're going to assume a liability, or if we're going to increase an exposure of liability due to a contract, we need to be able to review that contract and sign off on that risk on behalf of the state and on behalf of the State Office of Risk Management. So we just kind of gave you a quick copy of the statute there that kind of outlines that and highlighted the important sections of it. So when we're reviewing, go ahead and go on to the next slide. So when we're reviewing a contract, we're going to be reviewing the insurance clauses, the indemnification, and the limitation of liability. And in order for us to do that, we need to make sure that we have a copy of the contract that's being proposed with red lines and your statement of work. Those help us to analyze all three of those areas of requirement that we review for you on behalf of getting that contract approved and moving forward. So next slide, please. And insurance, our most common types of policies that we see on a contract are those 5 that are listed there: commercial liability, automobile liability, workers' compensation, cyber and privacy, and professional liability. So we're going to hit each one of those areas and kind of go through what they are. And then we're also going to give you some guidance as to whether you can waive that area on a particular contract or not. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So our first area of insurance is general liability. And this protects a business from exposing its financial assets when you have an employee or actions of the business that result in damage to property, bodily injury, what is called personal advertising injury. And that common loss for that is when somebody slanders you. That's a personal and advertising injury. We also have product liability under general liability. And product liability or completed operations is when you are actually producing something. So if we have a contractor that is physically making something for us or producing a policy that the state will be adopting, that's a product. And so that completed products operations is also a part of general liability. And we ask that our contractors have this general liability so that if there is a loss that's caused by them that causes damage to us, we're going to be covered for it. We're not going to incur that expense of having to cover that loss. So when can you waive general liability? That's a question we get a lot. So when there's no physical contact between the vendor and the state. So if you've got a contract where you're going to be communicating by phone or by email, and there isn't going to be a quote product that's created, and they're not going to be having contact where they might libel or a slander another entity, a third party, something like that. You don't have that type of an issue. You're just going to be communicating with that group. You don't necessarily need general liability. And example of that is exactly the video phone contact during a contract. And again, no completed product or operations. So things like interpreters where they're performing a service, a one-time service, they're not creating anything. You're not going to need them to have a general liability policy if they're not coming onto state property, if they're doing all of this by video or by phone. Any questions? Okay. Then I'm going to move on to the next. Oops. Hello? All right. Our next is automobile liability. And again, automobile liability is just like yourself. It protects you if you get involved in an accident. And in this case, we want our vendors to have an auto liability that will cover them if they're involved in an accident while performing services for the state. And an example of that is a delivery company that is picking up a state property and delivering it somewhere, a marketing company going out to an event to market for the state, and they have state product and stuff that they'll be distributing or state information. And then coming on to our state property for meetings where they'll interact with people and could actually cause an injury. I had a case as an adjuster where a vendor was walking through a work area and accidentally hit a rolling chair that was behind a person who was sitting down at the time, and the person fell and injured themselves. So that vendor was brought in on a liability claim by that employee. So that's the type of GL that we're talking, or excuse me, I was GL, I apologize. Auto liability is the same thing though. If you have a vendor come on who hits an employee's car or hits an employee, you want them to protect the state. You want them to be liable and pay the damages for that employee. So let's make sure that if they're coming onto our property that they have auto liability also. Sorry about that. Yes, Colleen, it does include leased offices or and state-owned property, because when we lease a property, it becomes, quote, a state property for purposes of us doing business. So yes, whether it's a leased property or state-owned property, we're going to want them to have that auto and GL coverage. Hold on just a second. Lisa, Do we need to get approval from SORM to waive general liability in the examples you shared, or can we make that determination at the agency level? That's why we're giving you this information, is if you have a contract where those conditions are met, you can go ahead and waive it. You don't need our permission. If you feel any question whatsoever that contract meets those, shoot us a quick email and just say, this is a scenario. We're going to waive the general liability. Do you have any issues? We'll answer that. We don't have to get in a super in-depth a review of that, but that's why we're giving you these guidelines, is so that you can apply this to some of your contracts. Okay. And Kim, you had asked about a dollar amount. The dollar amounts are in the templates for CCU. So those limits are minimums. And do remember that you can always increase that amount if you don't feel that it's a sufficient amount. But the amounts that we require for insurance purposes are not the limits of the vendor's exposure to us in case of a loss. And we'll kind of get into that a little more in the indemnification portion. So hang on there. The state contract templates do have the minimum amounts. And just remember that in general, no policy should have less than 1 million in liability coverage. That is pretty much the starting point for all of our policies of liability that we require. Okay. So when can you waive the auto liability policy? Again, when the person is not using their state or their vehicle to come onto state property, and when they're not transporting employees or state property. In those situations, then we don't need them to have an automobile liability policy. Dan, non-owned autos are different than rentals, correct? Are you talking about the contractor? So, yeah, non-owned autos are non-owned autos. So a rental is actually a non-owned auto. So when you're talking about having automobile liability coverage, and you're talking about your vendor, we get this sometimes with nonprofit groups that are our vendor, and their employees will sometimes use their own vehicles to come onto state property and interact with us. What we ask in those cases is when their employees are going to be using their personal autos, that our vendor have a non-owned auto liability policy. And you can purchase those as a commercial entity. And what that does is it literally provides a liability policy to that nonprofit or company and protects non-owned vehicles for liability when being used for the business of that nonprofit or vendor that we're contracting with. And so we would ask that they have a non-owned auto policy for that type of a situation. We do have some vendors who have said, we just rent a car and make sure that that car has the rental company's liability, etc. That's fine. Make sure you have that in the contract so that it's spelled out that that they have submitted that they rent a vehicle and that rental will have insurance on it through the rental company. We do that ourselves to sometimes push liability away from the state. So that's acceptable as long as they have proof of it. I would probably ask that they send you a copy of the rental agreement as a certificate of insurance for the automobile liability portion, if that is what they're claiming. Okay. Any questions? Awesome. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So workers' compensation. Again, if we have somebody coming onto our property, or if we have somebody performing a contract for us, we want to make sure that those employees are covered for workers' compensation. I can guarantee you if that person is not covered by workers' compensation and they get injured while performing work for us, that the state's going to be brought into that. So we do require that employers have workers' compensation on their employees. That is satisfactory of the statute here for Colorado workers' compensation requirements. There is an exception to that, and you can waive that coverage if you're dealing with a sole proprietor or a limited partnership company where all of the employees or the sole proprietor are the owners of the company. If everybody owns at least 10% of the company, then as owners, that company can waive the requirement for workers' compensation. So that is the only time you can waive that workers' compensation requirement. So just keep that in mind, but you can waive it in those situations. Let's see, I've got a couple of questions here in the chat room. Let's take a look here. How are students different from vendors when parking on campus? Well, students aren't employees and students aren't contractors. So, you know, we have no relationship with them. We don't have a business relationship with them. So we don't require from them to have insurance. The state requires them to have insurance because all of us are supposed to have insurance as auto owners, but we don't have any contractual issue where we become potentially liable for their actions because they're just students coming onto campus and it's their responsibility, it's their car. There's no issue there for us. There's no contractual issue for us to accept liability for their actions. So that's a huge difference. Okay, hold on just a second. Next slide, Nate. Let's go on to cyber or privacy. Unless anybody has any other questions regarding auto liability. Okay. So cyber or privacy coverage. This is required when we're exchanging data by email or other access from the contractor to our programs within our firewall, distribution of personal identifiable information, personal financial or personal health information. So if any of those situations are occurring, then our vendor needs to have a cyber or privacy coverage policy so that if there's some sort of a breach and that information is distributed, that the state is protected from those third-party claims and third-party damages that might occur from the distribution of that information. And currently, we do have vendors, excuse me, that have cyber or privacy coverage through another policy. Excuse me, just a second. I apologize for that. And currently those two coverages are either under the commercial general liability policy or under their professional liability policy, which we'll be getting to next. That is perfectly acceptable. If your vendor has those coverages available under the general liability or professional policy, that is fine. However, we do need to verify with those carriers that the limits for that privacy or cyber coverage meet our minimum requirements, which again are going to be $1 million for an occurrence. So just keep that in mind, that when you get that certificate of insurance, that it has that information. And I would put a sentence in that coverage section saying that their cyber coverage is being provided through their blank policy, general liability or professional liability policy, and that the coverage for the cyber loss meets or exceeds the $1 million per occurrence requirement that we have. Okay. So you can waive those coverages, however, when the following all apply. All right. So you're not exchanging personal information with your vendor. There's no programming or software being developed or used on behalf of the state or by the state from programming supplied by that vendor. There's no exchange of data over the internet, including that personal information. And there's no access within the firewall of the state's computer systems. If those four things apply, then you can waive that requirement. And again, we get that sometimes with vendors who are going on to a general public site to get information, but not within our firewall, and where that information doesn't contain privacy information, and they're not distributing that information, but it's already public anyway. So that's the type of situation where you might be able to waive that cyber or privacy coverage. So cyber and privacy, for the most part, are they the same thing? They are for the most part, but there is a difference. So for instance, when we have an interpreter or somebody who is doing in-home services, we see this sometimes from CDPHE or from Human Services. They're not exchanging information over the internet, so we don't really need a cyber policy, but there are policies that cover privacy. And so if that information on that patient or information that the interpreter collects for the person that they're performing those interpretation services for were to be disseminated, they could have a privacy coverage that protects them and thus the state from any claims from that person whose information was distributed. So that's the difference between a cyber and a privacy policy. And you're usually going to see the privacy policy just for those type of limited service occupations, such as an interpreter or in-home care service person. All right, let's move on to the next slide, please. Sorry, I'm a little delayed behind Nate here. So professional liability is our next area. And professional liability, again, protects the vendor from third-party claims when it's claimed that they damaged or injured another party due to their professional activities. An example of that, architects. Other examples, doctors, lawyers, nurses, people who need to be certified should have a professional liability policy. And for the most part, services that we are obtaining from them will require us to have them have a professional liability policy, so that if their actions damage a third party, we will seek coverage for our exposure from that third party through that professional liability policy of our vendor. And, you know, times that you could waive this requirement. We have times where we use architects or engineers to give us an opinion, but they're not and that certainly is something within their expertise. However, we are not building a product, or we are not taking their opinions and resting solely on that to create a policy or other state um, uh, uh, product. So in those cases where they're rendering an opinion, but the state is using that as one of many things in making a determination on a particular service, we don't necessarily need a professional liability policy from them. But we are going to want a professional liability policy if the architect is designing a building, or we have an engineer giving us um, uh, uh, blueprints for a dam, or we have doctors and nurses performing their duties at our state facilities. Um, uh, these are people that we're going to want to have a professional liability policy for. This is not for employees of the state. This is for vendors that we are contracting with to provide services. So keep that in mind. We only require this professional liability for people that are working for us but are not state employees. Okay. And oh, we do have a question. Does professional liability cover more than those entities listed in professional services as defined by procurement? Kim, I would have to get back to you. I don't know all of the entities listed in the professional services portion. So I'd have to look at that to see. But certainly if I've mentioned something that isn't in that, then I would say, yes, you would need to have a professional liability policy from that entity. But I'd have to look at that, and I'll have to get back to you on that one, Kim. Okay, so they don't have listed, Kim, based on your thing here, architect, engineer, landscape architect, surveyor, industrial hygienist. They don't have listed any medical professionals, and yes, we would need professional liability for somebody like that. An accountant would need to have a professional liability policy. So those are two right off the top of my head. If the person is licensed or certified, that's really the key. If they're providing a service to us and they have a license or a certificate, you should at least be looking for a professional liability policy. And then based on the scope of work, you may be able to waive that requirement or not, depending upon the services that they're providing for you. Okay, hope that helps. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide, please.
I think we had one more question in there, Lee, in the chat.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed it.
From Greg Smith.
Okay. Excellent question. Yes, professional liability and errors and omissions is the same thing. It just depends on the company, but it is the same thing. It's just like malpractice is really errors and omissions and or professional liability. It's just malpractice is the term for the policy for a medical professional, but all of those types of policies are the same thing. Okay. Any other questions? All right, so we're going to move on to some additional types of insurance that may be required based on the statement of work. In an earlier class, we had a question regarding grants. Someone had wanted to know if these insurance requirements apply to grants. The answer is yes, for the most part, because you're providing a grant to somebody who may be distributing money on your behalf or whatever, you still are going to have the same issues. Where you get into an additional coverage is crime. And so if you have a contract with a vendor who's collecting money on behalf of the state and distributing it or returning it back to the state, you're going to want a crime policy. If you're providing a grant or providing grant funds to a company that will then further distribute them, again, you're going to want to have a crime policy. And that policy will cover us in case of theft of that money or embezzlement of that money. So we see that sometimes with natural resources. They have various licensing that we have sites where the money is collected. If that site is maintained by a vendor and the vendor flows that money through to the state, you're going to want a crime policy on that contract. And that's really pretty much it for the crime policy. Builder's risk. This is needed on contracts where you have large value of construction materials that need to be stored until they're used. And so, believe it or not, construction materials are not covered under most property policies of insurance. So same thing if you're having your home built, those materials are not insured when they're just laying around the work site. So if you're ever going through construction, make sure you have a builder's risk policy. And that builder's risk policy is going to be based on the value of the products that are on site at any one time before they're actually put into the building in the construction process. If you have any questions regarding how much you'll need, we can help you work through that. So you would just reach out to Julie or myself, and we would work with you and with your builder to determine the amount of builder's risk that you would need to cover those materials, so that if anything happens, a fire or theft or a tornado comes through, whatever, that you would be covered for those materials and recovery of those materials. You wouldn't have to have that come out of pocket. Pollution. We require that whenever you're disturbing the ground. So if you have a vendor who's going to be digging a ditch on the property or tearing out a foundation area, or even knocking out walls, doing interior construction where they're going to be doing any kind of demolition, and you could have an exposure of paint or asbestos, lead, that type of thing. That contractor should have a pollution policy in case of they are digging in the ground and they rupture a tank, a natural gas tank, or sewer lines, whatever, anything that could result in the spill of chemicals or hazardous materials, or the release of hazardous materials. Make sure you have a pollution policy to cover you and the vendor for any third-party claims, and cover the state for the recovery and repair of that release of pollutants. Okay. And question: Does it apply to construction that is secured? Yes, it does. But when construction materials on the property, even if it's secured, it's not covered until it becomes a part of the structure. So the builder's risk policy would cover that property even when it's locked inside a shed or something like that, because until it's actually used in construction, it is considered construction materials. Inland marine is our last area of additional insurance that we see regularly, but not all the time. And inland marine is an old language from when, literally back in the 1700s, when materials were transported by boat and inland on streams and rivers. And but it all refers to property that is in transit. So your property coverage doesn't normally protect you when your products or your property is in transit. So once it's off of your premise and it's going on its way to another location, until it gets to that location, it's in transit. And so this inland marine policy protects that material. So we have a lot of departments where they may transport food for like schools or Department of Corrections. Certainly equipment. We've all had office equipment that's delivered to a location. So when it's going from a warehouse to our location, it's in transit, inland marine. So make sure that if you have anything like that, that you have that company have an inland marine policy that will cover the replacement cost value of the materials that are being transported. Okay. Any questions on that? All right, let's move on. Other insurance language. How are we doing on time? Okay. So these are areas on our insurance coverage that must be a part of the contracts when you have them written. And this includes purchase orders. A lot of people forget looking for this language in their purchase orders, but we have to have it there too, because we can have a huge loss from a purchase order. And again, from personal experience, I had a $300 purchase order once on a company that was replacing or repairing a leak in a women's restroom on the 18th floor of a high rise. They created a loss by rupturing the 2-inch water main, which they hadn't turned off. And it flooded 18 floors of this LA Century high rise building. And we ended up with about $26 million in claims. So you're probably not going to have that type of exposure every day, but a purchase order can still cost you a lot of money if you don't have the right coverage. So make sure that these additional sections are in that purchase order. So additional insured endorsement on the liability policies. Again, we want that vendor who's providing those services, even under the purchase order, to cover us by adding us as an additional insured on their liability coverage. It makes sure that we're going to be defended and that damages will be paid for under our behalf to third parties based on the vendor's actions. Second, primary and non-contributory clause with regard to vendor policies. We want our vendors' policies to be primary over the state self-insured program. And the reason why is most policies of insurance have clauses that state if there is other insurance or self-insured programs applicable to this loss, we will share the costs and the damages with that applicable policy. So obviously we don't want that. We didn't do anything wrong. We want them to pay for the costs. So make sure you have that primary non-contributory language in your purchase order. And then last, the waiver of subrogation in favor of the state. And that waiver of subrogation means that the liability policies won't come back to the state and try to collect from the state for any perceived liability or any perceived contribution. And again, that's important. We don't want to be spending our time in court defending the state against requests for 1% or 5% or 10% of a loss. So we require a waiver of subrogation in favor of the state, and that's on any contract, but also on purchase orders. So anyway, let's take a look at any questions we've had. I know this one always gives us a few questions. Do you get insurance certs when you're just issuing a purchase order or just rely on the fact that they are required to have insurance? I would say I would always request a certificate of insurance. It doesn't take your vendor long. As a broker, I can tell you, I had all day long customers calling and saying, I need a certificate of insurance for blah, blah, blah. And they can be issued in minutes, literally. So if I were you, I'd request a certificate of insurance. I'm going to leave that as a judgment call on your part, depending upon the size of the risk. But I would say it's a best practice. Try and get that certificate of insurance. Your vendors should be used to doing that. And again, all they have to do is call their broker, give them the information on us, and their broker can get that certificate of insurance out. It's really not that big a deal. Let's see. Right. That's another thing that Julie points out. The certificate of insurance is nice because the certificate of insurance from the broker actually gives us the insurance carrier information and policy information, coverage amounts, and the time frame from when that policy was in place and effective. So that is a benefit. If you have a loss and you have that certificate of insurance, we'll be able to go to that carrier and get that claim started really quickly. If we don't have that information, it might be a little more difficult getting that information out of your vendor if a loss occurs. So it's just kind of a nice thing to have in your back pocket. Any other questions? Okay, well, let's move on to the next slot area, which is indemnification. And so the term to indemnify is basically to protect another party from hurt or loss or damage. And so when we say we're going to indemnify someone, what we're saying is we're going to protect you from any claims from other people for damages or injury or loss of income, anything like that. We're going to protect you. We're going to indemnify you. Now, under the Risk Management Act, the state can only cover state-owned assets and employees within their scope and course and scope of employment. We're not allowed to indemnify somebody else for third-party actions, okay? There is an exception to that. So, Nate, if we could have the next slide, please. We have the landlord exemption or exception. And under the Risk Management Act, we are allowed to apply a limited endorsement or indemnification for landlords. And it applies to the losses from real property. So if we rent a unit or we rent a building, we basically tell the landlord, under limited circumstances, we're going to be able to indemnify you for actions from a third party. And here's the specific wording. Now, this wording in yellow comes from the statute. This is the wording that should be on your contract if you're going to be indemnifying a landlord. And this is really the only acceptable wording that we allow. Sometimes our contractors will try and change that. You definitely need to get us involved if that's occurring, because this is statutory language and it should not be altered or changed. Any questions about that? Okay, let's go on to the next slide on indemnification. So the other part in our contracts with our vendors is the sections where we tell them what we expect them to indemnify us for. And so this is the 3 areas where you'll see, usually in the general conditions of the contract, these 3 paragraphs regarding indemnification under these 3 areas: general liability, contractual liability, and intellectual property. So under general liability, which we've already discussed, it's usually some sort of a claim arising from a general activity. The contractor left a cord out and somebody tripped over it, or potentially a product's completed operations where the product that they developed for us or built for us is somehow faulty and causes damage to another party. or even the slander, libel, etc. And so those all come under the general liability. And so we ask that the vendor indemnify us for their actions creating those type of liabilities. And so that is the first area of general liability indemnification we require from our vendors. The second is contractual liability. And for that, again, we're looking for the vendor to indemnify us for third-party claims that arise from the contractor's failure to uphold their contract requirements. And so if the contractor fails to do something, and as a result of that, we have a third party that has either some sort of damage to their property because the contractor failed to adequately support a wall or something, or more likely that the third party has some sort of a monetary loss because they were unable to do something based on the fact that the contractor had failed to enforce or to do their contractual requirement. That's that contractual liability where the contractor says, we're going to do this. We didn't do this. We have a third party claim. The state's going, you got to indemnify us. You need to defend us on this, pay the damages, whatever. So that's the second area of contractual liability. And then, indemnification that we want from the contractor. And then the last is the intellectual property. And that usually comes in from an IT situation, though it can come in marketing materials. And specifically, an intellectual property is normally something that is trademarked and or patented. So if we were to use a bit of programming in one of our applications, and we got this application from a vendor, and this portion of this programming that's used to make this application work actually belonged to another company, and we did not have the intellectual property rights to use that portion of that programming, we could be sued for that. And so this indemnification of the contract, we ask that our vendor indemnify us for those type of claims from that third party where they failed to protect intellectual property rights. Okay? Any questions on those three? If you ever have somebody redlining those three areas, again, we're going to have to review it. Sometimes it's something that we can accept. For the most part, though, we try and keep those sections as written. There's a reason why they were written the way they are. All right. Let's go on to limitation of liability. So limitation of liability, again, is an area of the contract that usually cause a lot of discussion and contention. And the reason why for us is, the state is not allowed to indemnify a third party, a vendor. And when a vendor requests that we have a limitation of liability, they are essentially saying that. They are essentially saying, we might do something wrong, but we don't want to be 100% responsible for it. We want you to be responsible for a portion of that. So limitations of liability, yes, Amber, they're my favorite too. So limitations of liability are a hard thing for us. But we also have recognized that if we're to have contracts with the public and private parties, that this is becoming more and more acceptable. And if we're to compete and have those contracts, we're going to have to make some sort of a concession in this area. So we have developed wording that we have said can be used in cases where a limitation of liability is warranted or acceptable due to the risk. And that wording is what we want you to use if requested to have one. Now, this all developed from IT contracts. We've got a lot of this in the IT world, and a lot of it has to do with the increasing issues of breaches and exposures to malware and ransomware, that type of thing. It has just exploded. It's created a very tough market for insurance, and we had to do this in order to compete and to get some of these contracts that we need. So Nate's been kind enough to pull up that next slide for us. So when you want a limitation of liability, we ask that you provide us with a risk analysis. And Nate, can you put up that link again that you did for the last session? The link to the form for CCU. That needs to be filled out. It asks you a lot of questions regarding what the scope of work is, what particular risks are, exposures, etc. And that should be filled out if you're requesting a limitation of liability, so that we can review that, do that risk analysis for you, and help you determine what a fair limitation of liability would be to both you and the vendor. Recognize that limitation of liability, losses involving that, any loss over that limitation of liability becomes the department's expense. So if you have a loss for, $5 million and you have a limitation of liability for 3 million, your department could be hit with that $2 million loss, and that will come right from your budget. So keep that in mind whenever you're discussing limitations of liability, that you might need this contract, but you also have to weigh that against the risks. And that's why having that form filled out so we can help you analyze that risk and arrive at a limitation of liability is so important. This is only going to become even more important as the insurance market tightens during some of these cyber issues, ongoing cyber issues. So Nate, if we could go to the next screen, please. So this is the wording that has been approved by SORM and the controller. And this is, if someone wants a limitation of liability, this is your starting point. So what it does in the first paragraph is it lays out the limitation of liability, the damages, and the amount of that limitation of liability. Now, the 4 points underneath it, those are areas where we don't allow a limitation of liability to apply. And that is for several reasons. Part of it's dealing with the defense. The state does ask that a vendor indemnify us for losses that are their fault. Remember, these limitations of liability, we're talking about losses that are the vendor's responsibility, and we're limiting that. But we still expect indemnification on certain areas. And so the limitation of liability does not apply to the indemnification obligations, because part of those those indemnification obligations are to defend. And if we didn't put this in there, they might say, well, we'll indemnify you for the damages, but you're still going to have to run into the expense of defending yourself. And that's a very expensive proposition. So we don't allow the vendor's indemnification obligations to apply to that limitation of liability. Claims or damages arising from a loss that is covered by insurance. So let's say that we have a liability, general liability limit of $1 million. And we have a general liability loss of 5 million. And the vendor has 5 million in coverage. Our policy just requires them to have a minimum of $1 million. We want that full $5 million policy that they have. the citizens of the state of Colorado should not have to pay $4 million out of pocket when there's insurance that will cover it. So we don't allow the limitation of liability to apply for a loss where there's policies of insurance in place that would cover that, and that money isn't coming out of the vendor's pocket. Claims or damages arising out of bodily injury, including death or damage to tangible property of the state. So again, we're talking about damages to the state that could arise from a vendor's actions. We want to make sure that that damage to the actual state property is not part of a limitation of liability. And then finally, claims or damages resulting from reckless or intentional misconduct. I think that probably makes sense to everybody. We're not going to allow the contractor to limit their liability for any actions that they did intentionally or with recklessness that result in damages to the state or to third parties. They've got to be on the hook for those damages without a limitation. So it looks like we have a question here. Can you substitute contract for purchase order in the revised wording? I'm not sure. Oh, yeah, absolutely. If you're talking about wording for a purchase order and all of our wording has contract in it, you can certainly say, based on the purchase order versus based on the contract, yes, you could do that. Any other questions? And again, on this example in the yellow, I see what you're saying is number one, it says under this purchase order. Yes, it could say this contract or purchase order, depending upon what you're using. Absolutely. Would we insert this after yes. I mean, if you've got a request for a limitation of liability on a contract, you would insert that language at that point once we've reviewed it and said, yeah, this makes sense, we can do it. And then you would insert that, yes. Any other questions on this slide? Okay, Nate, let's move to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, let me go. Does a limitation on the submission need to go to SORM?
I'll jump in here, Lee.
Thanks.
The e-submission system does not route to SORM. So when it comes to CCU, so when we get a limitation of liability in the system, usually by that point, it has been negotiated as part of the contract, and the approval for the limitation of liability is approved simultaneously with the execution of the contract. So view it more as a record keeping of a limitation of liability approval instead of negotiating limitation of liability and getting risk management's approval.
Okay.
And there is a limitation of liability policy in the works. It will kind of spell out that process and make sure everybody's on the same page.
It's a fun issue for all of us. Nate and I have spent many times together just laughing.
Better than crying, right?
Gallows humor. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. Oh, you have, great. So this is one last thing that we have to remember on our limitation of liability issues is direct versus indirect damages. And a lot of times, in addition to the limitation of liability, our vendors want to limit the damages to direct versus indirect damages. So a couple of examples of this on both a property and a compute and a IT side. On a property side, let's say that your vendor backs into an electrical circuit for your building and all the electricity in the building is knocked out. Direct damages would pay for the cost to repair the building damage from the impact and that electrical circuit to get the electricity back up. What it would not pay for is any costs for recovery of equipment that was damaged due to any electrical surge. It wouldn't cover loss of business income if you have vendors in the building that were unable to work. It would not cover employee wages. Anything like that is an indirect, and the department would be on the hook for that. The vendor would only pay for those damages to the actual electrical circuitry that was damaged and any building damage. On a computer side, let's say that the contractor does something that wipes out an application, and we can't even wait for them to repair it. We have to get a new application because it's so damaged and the process is so damaged that the time to do this would not be economically feasible. In that scenario, the direct damages would be the cost to replace that program, so buying a new program. What would not be covered is any of the employee time needed to transfer data from the old application to the new application. Any employee time used in locating or finding a new program. Any of those type of costs that aren't directly related to the actual application would not be covered. That would all come out of your budget. Any third-party claims that somebody was dependent on that site for information to conduct their business, and they file a claim for 2 weeks downtime while it takes us to get the new application. All of that would come to us. It would not go to that vendor because it's all indirect damages. So you've got to think about that when you've got a contractor trying to define things like direct versus indirect. These are costs that will come out of your pocket that won't be covered. So think about that as you're going through a limitation of liability also. These are things that we will bring to your attention when we do a review on your behalf, but just keep those in mind also as you decide whether you want to accept a change or not. Let's go ahead and go on to the next slide, Nate. So basically, in summary, limitation of liabilities, we don't recommend them because it exposes your department to financial loss. We also recognize, however, that you may have to do a limitation of liability because of the market, because of the need to get a program or a contract in place for services. So having said that, you'll have to fill out that risk analysis so that we can review that limitation of liability. You should always use the recommended language that we have, and that's in this slide previously, a couple slides back. You should never have a limitation of liability less than $1 million. That's the risk the state has from third parties, and you're going to want to make sure that you have at least that covered. So again, we recommend no limitation of liability less than $1 million. And any loss due to a limitation of liability comes out of the department's budget, not out of the risk pool. Please keep that in mind. Let your departments know that you're working on this contract with that, this is your risk, this is what we've worked out, but this is your exposure. You may have to have that if you were to have some sort of a large or catastrophic loss. All right, so in conclusion, let's move on to that last slide there. as the contract negotiator, you do have the ability to consider waiving insurance requirements when applicable. So that's what we've given to you on those first 5 slides with general liability, auto liability, workers' comp, cyber and privacy language, and professional liability. You can waive those, but if you have a question or you're worried that you're not comfortable with that, shoot us an email with the contract. Let us know what you're going to do. Statement of work. We can review that really quickly for you. We also recommend highly that before you go out to RFP, that you allow us to review your sample contract that you're going to post with your RFP. We can, certainly make some recommendations for you before you post it that might help you to have better negotiations with that contractor that you choose. So that's another suggestion. Indemnification of a vendor is allowed only for landlords, and you need to use that specific statutory language. And limitation of liability should be considered on IT contracts only. However, we understand that that might be needed on other types of contracts. Make sure you fill out that risk analysis so we can assist you with that review. And so that's the end of our presentation. Any other questions? Let me take a look at the chat. We've got some new messages here. Hold on. So, can you speak to aviation insurance for transporting employees? Okay, so aviation is not covered under the CGIA, but we do have aviation insurance that you can purchase through our broker, Willis Towers Watson. So you should reach out to them to discuss your aviation insurance needs, because again, aviation insurance is not part of the CGIA, and so you would need an aviation policy. Willis Towers Watsons are the people who would be able to best provide you with that information. Same with drones, they're under aviation policies. So again, you're going to want to talk to Willis Tower Watson. But if you're asking if you have an aviation contract, then you're going to have, again, workers' comp you're going to want if somebody's providing you with, like you said, aerial spraying of herbicides, that type of thing. You're still going to want a pollution policy for that. You're going to want to have a general liability policy for that, but it's an aviation policy. And so they are a little specialized. Gosh, excuse me. You're going to want to make sure that their policy limits are such that if there is a crash, that their liability limits will cover the number of passengers that would be in that plane for the statutory limits of the state, which now they just changed in January. I think it's $1.125 million. So you're going to want to make sure that you have enough liability coverage on that aviation policy to cover those employees. Your sports teams charters. Teams charters are going to be different. If it's a charter, it's going to be just like renting a coach bus. That charter company should have general liability, all of that type of coverage. You're going to want to make sure that, again, workers' comp, general liability, aviation, general liability, coverage for those policies. And again, you're going to want to make sure that they have at least 1.125 million. I would suggest, depending upon the number of people, like on a charter, if team members, that you might want to change that minimum requirement. And if that's the case, certainly come to Julie and I. We would assist you with figuring out what your minimum limits should be on that charter. And drones, are you talking about renting drones, or having somebody supply you with drone services?
Yeah, it would be supplying us with drone services.
Okay, so again, it's just going to be like the aviation policy. You're going to want to make sure that they have a policy that's got at least 1 million in general liability. So if they crash that drone into something and damage it, the state is covered. You're going to be wanted to be an additional insured under that liability policy. Same thing with all of the issues of being an additional insured, subrogation waiver. You're going to want to make sure that the person who's operating that drone has workers' comp in case they're injured while performing those services for you. You want to make sure that their employer has workers' comp. If you're hiring an independent drone operator, then he can waive that workers' comp requirement. That's his decision, but make sure that's in the contract, that they're either covered by workers' comp, or that as sole owner that they have waived workers' comp. If they drive to your site with the drone, you're going to want to make sure they have auto insurance liability, and probably professional liability also, simply because as a drone operator, they are licensed and certified. And so if there's pilot error, that might not come under a general policy. So make sure that they have a professional liability policy, or if they have an aerial or aviation general liability policy, that it covers pilot error. Does that make sense, Greg?
Yes, thank you.
Sure, no problem. Okay.
I think that's a wrap, Lee, unless there's any other questions you see there.
Jeb, you asked about 1.125 each. No, the statutory limits, Julie, if you're on, do you remember what the January change was? It was 387.
Yes, ma'am. Let me pull it up here.
I think it's like 400 something.
It's like 482 something something. I want to make sure I get the right number.
425, 415.
I'm looking. Put it somewhere really safe.
I hate that when I do that. What we could do is get you all a copy of the new statutory law. That's the reference. So the 1.125 that I put there, and again, it's the new statutory. That's per occurrence, no matter how many claimants are involved. So, and what that means, Jeb, is that if you've got a claim and there's 4 or 5 people involved, the most they're going to get is like 300,000 each or whatever. But that 1.125 is per occurrence. So that's the limit that you want to make sure that they have. And again, we've got a new one in the new statute. And Nate, if we get that information to you, can you make sure it gets distributed to the attendees for both sessions?
Absolutely.
Sure, cool.
All right, guys, we're a little over our time and everyone else is waiting for you. Sounds like you had some good discussions. So maybe we can all go back to the main room if you're not in the middle of answering a question.
Sorry, we were having all kinds of fun.
Thank
That's
you, Lee and
fantastic.
Julie.
That's amazing. You guys
Suzanne,
are
did you-
wonderful.
Suzanne just posted those limits.
Yeah,
424.
1.195, not 1.125. 1.195 is our new per occurrence. So, Anyway, that's it. So thank you all for attending. If you have any additional questions that we couldn't get to, please make sure that they get forwarded to us. We'll be happy to take care of those for you. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. And if you click leave room instead of leave